My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 29 years old, and the exact moment I understood my position in this family was not the night my sister called from a casino parking lot in tears, or the morning my parents emptied their joint savings account without telling me, or even the afternoon my mother looked me in the eyes and said the words she can never take back. It was the silence that came after. The kind of silence that tells you everything a family has spent years carefully not saying out loud. 3 weeks before all of this unraveled, I had been managing the back end of my parents' rental properties while simultaneously trying to ignore a pain in my lower back that a specialist had already told me was not going away on its own. My sister, meanwhile, had driven herself into $40,000 of debt across 2 credit cards, a personal loan she took in my father's name without fully telling him, and whatever she had left on a table at a casino resort outside Knoxville during what she described to my parents as a girls' weekend. She is 34 years old. She has done some version of this before. But in my family, my sister has always been the one worth catching. Before I tell you exactly what I did when they finally chose her over my spine, let me ask you something. Have you ever been so useful to the people who love you that they stopped seeing the difference between what you gave and what you were owed? Because that is the trap I lived in for 6 years. And I didn't even know it had a name until my best friend named it for me on a Tuesday night in my kitchen, while I was trying not to cry into a bowl of soup I couldn't finish. My parents, Gerald and Patricia Callahan, owned 4 rental properties outside of Charlotte that my father had bought in his 50s as a retirement plan. They were good properties. A duplex near a university, 2 single-family homes in the same neighborhood, and a converted garage apartment behind the house where I grew up. My father understood plumbing and curb appeal. What he did not understand, and what he had made very clear he had no intention of understanding, was anything involving a lease agreement, a tax form, a maintenance request portal, or the annual inspection checklist required by the county housing authority. That was where I came in. I worked full-time as a project coordinator for a mid-sized commercial interiors firm in uptown Charlotte, which meant I spent my days managing timelines, vendor contracts, permit applications, and the specific kind of professional chaos that erupts when a contractor shows up to the wrong building with the wrong materials, and everyone acts like this is somehow the coordinator's fault. I was good at it, organized, thorough, calm under pressure. My father noticed those qualities the way people notice a good flashlight. Useful when things are dark. Forgotten when the sun is out. Over the years, my role at the rental properties had grown so gradually I never saw it accumulate. It started with one lease renewal my father asked me to look over because, and I remember his exact phrasing, "You're good with the fine print, Nora." Then it was setting up the online maintenance portal because the property management software confused him. Then it was filing the annual housing inspection reports, then managing the tenant communication templates, then handling the quarterly tax payment reminders, then negotiating a new insurance rate when their provider flagged one of the properties during a routine audit. By the time I was 27, I was doing the work of a part-time property manager for 4 properties, entirely without pay, entirely alongside a full-time job, entirely because my family had decided that this is what the organized one does. My sister Delia, in the meantime, bounced between jobs she described as transitional, relationships she described as complicated, and financial decisions she described as unlucky. She was not stupid. She was charming, charismatic, and deeply practiced in the specific art of performing crisis in a way that made my parents feel needed instead of drained. When Delia called, there was always an emergency. When I called, there was always an assumption that I was fine. I mostly was fine. Until I wasn't. The back pain started as something I could rationalize. Long days at a desk, carrying equipment on site, not stretching enough. By the time I finally went to a doctor, it had already become the kind of pain that changes your posture without you realizing it, the kind you work around until you can't anymore. The imaging came back with findings my specialist described with the careful precision of someone who has learned to deliver bad news to people sitting alone in paper gowns. I had a herniated disc pressing against a nerve root in a way that was, in his words, not something we can manage indefinitely with physical therapy and anti-inflammatories. I needed surgery. Not tomorrow, but not next year either. Somewhere in the window of soon. The procedure itself was not the most expensive surgery a person could face, but it wasn't small either. Between the hospital fee, Anesthesia, surgeon cost, and the follow-up care. I was looking at a gap between what my insurance covered and what I actually owed that made my stomach drop the first time I saw the estimate. I had savings. Not enough savings. Not after 6 years of being the kind of person who lends money to her sister's emergencies and absorbs costs that weren't hers to carry. I called my mother on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in my car in the parking deck outside my office because I needed the privacy and the concrete walls to hold the sound of whatever her reaction was going to be. She answered after 2 rings, slightly breathless, and I could hear my father's voice in the background asking something I couldn't make out. I told her about the surgery. I explained the nerve compression, the timeline the specialist had given me, the gap in what I could cover. I told her I wasn't asking for all of it. I was asking if they could help with part of it while I figured out the rest. There was a pause. Then my mother said, "Honey, this is actually really bad timing." She told me what I did not yet know. That my sister had called them 48 hours earlier in full breakdown mode from a casino parking lot outside Knoxville. That the $40,000 in debt had come out over the course of a long and wrenching phone call during which my sister had apparently sobbed, hyperventilated, and repeated some version of "I don't know what I'm going to do" until my parents were convinced they were the only thing standing between Delia and complete collapse. They had already transferred money, a significant amount. Not quite everything, but close enough that when I mentioned my surgery estimate, my mother's voice had the hollow quality of an account that has already been emptied. "We'll figure something out," she said. "But right now your sister really needs us." I said, "Mom, I need surgery." And then my father, who had apparently taken the phone from her without announcing himself, said the sentence that will live permanently in the part of my brain where I file the things I cannot unfeel. "Delia's situation is a crisis, Nora. Yours is a procedure. You're capable. You'll handle it." Capable, like it was a compliment. Like telling me I was strong enough to survive being deprioritized was the same as actually caring whether I survived. I remember the parking deck smelling like exhaust and old concrete. I remember the specific way the fluorescent light in my car flickered once, and then held. I remember thinking I'm not going to cry and then crying anyway. But quietly, the way you learn to cry when you've spent your whole life being the one who doesn't make things harder. I drove home. I sat on my couch. I stared at the wall. And then something shifted that I can only describe as the moment a door that has been cracked open for years finally closes all the way. My best friend Maya, who is a surgical nurse and therefore both practically useful and constitutionally unable to soften hard truths, came over that evening with food. She insisted on calling dinner, even though it was mostly snacks, arranged aggressively on a plate. She sat across from me on the coffee table with her feet tucked under her and listened to the whole story without interrupting, which for Maya is a genuine act of discipline. When I finished, she said, "Okay, walk me through everything you do for their properties." So I did. Lease renewals, insurance renewals, housing authority inspections, maintenance portal management, tenant screening documentation, quarterly tax reminders, utility billing, reconciliation for the duplex units. All of it. Every piece. She looked at me for a moment. "And none of that is in writing anywhere? Like, no contract? No arrangement? Nothing?" "Nothing," I said. She nodded slowly, the way she nods when she is deciding which part of a problem to address first. Then she said, "What happens if you stop?" I looked at her. I hadn't let myself think it that directly yet. "The leases would expire without renewal," I said. "The inspection reports would go unfiled. They'd lose the housing authority certification on the duplex, which means they can't legally rent those units until they're recertified, which takes weeks. Their insurance carrier sends renewal notices to my email. If I don't respond, coverage lapses. And the tax calendar I maintain is the only reason my dad hasn't missed a quarterly payment in 4 years. Maya put her food down. "Nora, they didn't just deprioritize your surgery. They've been running their retirement income on your unpaid labor for 6 years. I knew that. I had known it in the fuzzy background way you know things you're not ready to look at directly." Hearing Maya say it out loud in the same voice she uses to tell patients their test results felt different. Clinical. True. "You're not going to disappear on them," she said. "But you're going to stop being invisible." I slept badly that night. and woke up with the specific clarity that only comes from pain and exhaustion burning away everything that isn't essential. I lay on my side because lying flat still hurt, and I thought about what my father had called me: capable. The word he used to excuse leaving me alone with a medical bill and a nerve pressing into my spine. I called in late to work and opened my laptop. I spent the morning doing something I had never done before, which was reading the documentation of my own involvement in my parents' business as a stranger would read it. The leases I had last renewed, and which would come due in 8 weeks. The Housing Authority certification for the duplex, which required an annual inspection filing I had already scheduled but not yet submitted. The insurance renewal notice sitting in my inbox from 3 weeks ago, flagged and waiting, that I had not yet processed because I had been managing a project deadline at my actual job. The maintenance portal, the tax calendar, the tenant communication, threads going back 2 years. I was not just helping them. I was the system. And systems don't disappear cleanly. They wind down, and the winding down has consequences that are impossible to hide. I want to be very clear about what I decided that morning, because I have told this story to people who assumed I did something ruthless, something calculated to destroy. That is not what happened. What happened is that I decided to tell the truth, to stop performing a role I had never officially agreed to hold, to stop being the electricity in a house that hadn't bothered to check whether the wires were connected to a person. I opened a document and wrote a clear, professional letter to my parents. I told them that, effective in 2 weeks, I would no longer be managing any administrative, compliance, or operational tasks for their rental properties. I told them I would provide a full handoff document containing every active lease, renewal date, vendor contact, maintenance request, tax deadline, and insurance account. I told them I would transfer the tenant portal login and the insurance email correspondence. I would leave nothing undone that could fairly be called sabotage. I would simply stop doing unpaid work for people who had looked at my medical need and called it less urgent than my sister's gambling debt. Then I called the County Housing Authority to update the point of contact on the duplex certification file. Then I forwarded the insurance renewal notice to my father with a single line: "This needs your response by the deadline. I'm no longer managing insurance for the properties." Then I texted my mother: "I'm sending you a handoff document for the rental properties by Friday. After that, I won't be managing them. I need to focus on my surgery and my own finances." She read it immediately. I watched the typing indicator appear, disappear, appear again. Then she called. I let it ring. The next 2 days were strange and quiet in the way before weather. I went to work. I managed a flooring vendor miscommunication with the same calm efficiency I always had. I had lunch at my desk. I started building the handoff document, every folder labeled with the obsessive clarity of someone who wants it understood later that she left nothing in chaos. She simply left. My father left a voicemail the first evening. His voice was controlled in the way it gets when he is deciding whether to be angry or strategic. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, Nora. But don't do anything drastic with the properties. We can talk about this." My mother texted 3 times that same night. The first 2 were variations on "please don't make this worse." The third was, "Your sister is going through a lot right now. She needs the family to hold together." I read all of it. I didn't respond to any of it. Maya checked in every evening with a single text that just said, "status." I texted back the same word each time, "holding." On Friday morning, I sent the email. It had 19 attachments and a summary document organized by property, by deadline, and by urgency. Every piece of information they needed was there, clean and complete, because I had never been the kind of person who leaves a mess behind even when the people in the house deserved one. Then I removed my email as the primary contact on the Housing Authority file. Then I archived the insurance thread from my inbox without responding, because I had already told my father it required his response. Then I sent a message to the tenant in the garage apartment, a quiet graduate student named Priya, who deserved to know who to contact going forward, giving her my parents' direct number and letting her know the management contact was changing. By 11 in the morning, my phone was ringing with a number I recognized as the insurance agency. By noon, my father had called 4 times. By 2, my mother had left a voicemail so fractured and panicked that I had to sit down after listening to it, not because it moved me back toward helping them, but because it was the first time in my adult life I had heard my mother sound genuinely afraid of a consequence she could not ask me to absorb. The housing authority, she said, sent an automated notice about an incomplete contact update. The insurance agent called her directly because the primary email on the renewal was no longer responding. The tenant at the duplex had texted asking who to call about a leaking faucet, and my mother, who has never managed a maintenance request in her life, did not know what portal to use or what the protocol was. 6 years of invisible infrastructure, unplugged in a single morning. I sat in my parked car outside a pharmacy where I had gone to pick up pain medication, and I listened to my mother's voicemail twice. The second time, I paid attention not to the panic, but to what was underneath it. Not anger, not blame, something more honest. Disorientation. The sound of someone who has just discovered that a thing she took for granted was being held up by something specific, something human, something that had finally decided to set it down. I did not call her back. That evening, my sister called. I almost didn't answer. But there was a part of me that had been waiting for this particular conversation since the day I understood what my family was, and I was tired of waiting for it to be over. She started with her voice in the register she uses when she wants to seem reasonable and also blameless at the same time. "Nora, I think you're being really unfair to Mom and Dad right now." I said, "Hi, Delia." She pushed forward. "They're stressed. The properties are a mess, apparently. And you know Dad can't deal with all of that paperwork on his own." "I know," I said. "That's why I did it for 6 years." She paused. Then, "This isn't the time for you to make a point. Mom is exhausted." "I'm also exhausted," I said. "I've had nerve compression in my spine for months. I need surgery." I called Mom to ask for help with part of the cost, and Dad told me my situation was a procedure, not a crisis. So I stopped doing their work for free. That's the whole story. Silence on her end. The kind that means she is recalculating. "You know they were just trying to help me," she said finally. "I know," I said. "So why are you punishing them for it?" "I'm not punishing anyone," I told her. "I just stopped volunteering." She switched tactics the way she always does, moving from accusation to wounded performance without a seam showing. "I'm already dealing with so much right now. I don't need you adding stress to the family on top of everything else." "Delia," I said, "I need surgery. I have been doing unpaid administrative work for Mom and Dad for 6 years. I need to use the time and energy I have left to take care of myself. That's not about you." She said I was being selfish. I said I was being available to myself for the first time in a long time. She said that wasn't the same thing. I said I know, and then I said goodbye, and ended the call. Maya sent me a text that said status, and I sent back still holding. And then I made tea and sat at my kitchen table and cried in a way that was not about fear or defeat. It was the specific grief of people who have spent years waiting for their family to see them and finally, irreversibly, stopped waiting. The real confrontation happened 10 days later. My father asked me to come to the house. Not requested. Asked, in the way that expects compliance. He said we needed to sit down as a family and work this out before the duplex certification lapsed completely. I almost said no. I had every reason to say no, but I thought about what Maya had said. That there's a difference between setting a boundary and disappearing, and I decided I wanted to be in the room when my family finally had to say out loud what they had been thinking quietly for years. I drove myself this time, without Maya, because I wanted to prove to myself that I didn't need a spotter to stand in my own family's kitchen. My father was at the kitchen table with a folder in front of him. My mother was at the counter making coffee she didn't offer me. My sister was there too, which I had not expected, sitting in the chair by the window with her phone face down in her lap and an expression of studied neutrality that told me she had been coached. My father said, "Sit down." I said, "I'll stand. Go ahead." He went through the list. The insurance lapse warning, the housing authority certification flag, the tenant complaint about the faucet that still hadn't been routed to anyone. He presented all of it as if it were evidence of something I had done to them rather than something they had built entirely on top of me. When he finished, I said, "You have everything you need in the handoff document." He said, "Nora, that document assumes I have time to learn a system from scratch in the middle of a crisis." I said, "Dad, I learned it from scratch. while working full-time, without being asked and without being paid. My mother turned from the counter. "You were always so good at it." The kindness in her voice almost made it worse, because she meant it as a compliment and had no idea it was a confession. "Being good at something doesn't mean it's mine to carry forever," I said. My father's jaw tightened. "We're a family. This is what families do for each other." "Is it?" I asked. "Because when I called Mom about my surgery, you told me my situation was a procedure and Delia's was a crisis. So help me understand what the rule actually is. Because from where I'm standing, family means I help with everything, and you help with things that involve Delia." Nobody spoke. My sister shifted in her chair. I could feel her wanting to interject, but something in the quality of the silence seemed to hold her back. My father said, "That's not fair." "Which part isn't fair?" I asked. "That I said it, or that it's true?" He looked at my mother. She looked at the coffee she was still holding. My sister looked at the window. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded estimate from my specialist. I set it on the table in front of my father. "That's what the surgery costs after insurance," I said. "I'm not asking you to cover it. I have a payment plan. I have a date scheduled. I'm doing what you told me to do. I'm handling it. But I need you to understand that the reason I can't cover it more easily is because I have spent 6 years absorbing costs that weren't mine. Time, energy, money I lent when Delia needed it, administrative labor I did for free, and emotional bandwidth I spent reassuring everyone in this family that I was fine while I was quietly not fine." My mother set her mug down very carefully. My father looked at the estimate on the table. He didn't touch it. My sister said, quietly, "Nora, I didn't know you needed surgery." I looked at her. "Did you ask?" She didn't answer. I didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything left to say that the silence wasn't already saying more accurately. I picked up the estimate, folded it, put it back in my bag, and told them that the handoff document had everything they needed and that I would not be returning to that role. My father said, "So that's it? You're just done?" I thought about it for a second. Actually, genuinely thought about it. Standing in the kitchen where I had grown up being the dependable one, the capable one, the one who handled things, I said, "I'm done doing it for free, and I'm done doing it without being asked." Then I left. Maya was waiting in the parking lot of the coffee shop 2 blocks away, because I had texted her the address before I went in and she had driven there anyway, and said nothing about it until I appeared, at which point she handed me an iced coffee and said, "How bad?" I buckled my seatbelt and thought about it. "Bad enough that it was real," I said. "Better than it's ever been, because they finally heard me." She nodded. Then she drove. My surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later. The payment plan was manageable, tight but manageable, and my supervisor at work had quietly approved me for short-term leave in a way that made me understand she had known something was wrong for longer than I had admitted. Priya, the graduate student in the garage apartment, sent me a text after my mother finally responded to her faucet request, saying she hoped things were okay and that she had always appreciated how quickly I responded to things. I thanked her and did not explain anything. The morning of the surgery, I woke up before my alarm and lay in the dark thinking about what I was afraid of. Not the procedure. The specialist was experienced and calm, and had answered every question I asked without making me feel like a burden for having them. What I was afraid of, I realized, was how much space I had spent my whole life trying to take up as little of as possible. How many times I had described my own pain as not that bad. How many things I had called manageable when the right word was actually unacceptable. Maya drove me. She sat in the waiting area during the procedure and was there when I came out of recovery, and she made exactly one joke at my expense, which I appreciated because it meant she wasn't scared anymore. My mother sent a text while I was still in recovery. It said, "Let us know how it goes." Not "I'm sorry." Not "I should have been there." Not "we were wrong about what mattered." Just information retrieval. Just logistics. My father sent nothing until the next morning, at which point he sent a message asking if I had thought any more about reinstating access to the insurance portal. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I forwarded it to Maya with no comment. She sent back a string of punctuation marks that conveyed everything. Recovery was slow and not graceful. I spent the first week on my couch moving between sleep and a mild, cottony consciousness that felt like living inside a cloud with bad lighting. Maya came by every other day. A colleague from work sent me a food delivery gift card. Priya left a small plant outside my door with a note that said, "Get well," which was such a quietly kind thing to do that I cried a little, which I blamed on the medication. My family called twice that week. Both times were my mother. Both times circled back, eventually, to something related to the properties. The second call, I let go to voicemail and did not return. What I didn't know, until Maya told me 3 weeks later, was what had been happening on their end while I recovered. The housing authority had flagged the duplex certification as incomplete and sent a formal notice requiring direct owner verification before the next rental cycle. My father had spent 4 hours on the phone trying to navigate a process I had been quietly handling in 45 minutes once a year. The insurance carrier required an in-person meeting to confirm the updated contact structure and review the policy terms, which my parents had never had to read before because I had always summarized the relevant parts for them. One of the single-family tenants had raised a concern about a gutter issue that had been in the maintenance queue for months, which I had been planning to address but had never submitted before I stepped back. Because the portal was now managed by my father, who had never used it, the ticket sat unresolved until the tenant sent a formal letter. The system, removed from its invisible maintenance, revealed its actual condition. My father called at the end of the 3rd week, and his voice had changed. Not apologetic. My father does not do apologetic in any clean or usable form, but the bravado was gone. What was left was something more tired, more honest. He said, "Things have been harder to manage than I expected." I said, "Yes, they would be." A pause. "You made it look simple." "It wasn't," I said. "It was just invisible." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The surgery went okay?" It was 4 weeks post-op. The fact that this was the first time he had asked was not lost on either of us. I could hear that it was not lost on him either. "Yes," I said. "It went okay." Another pause. Longer than the first. Then, "Good. That's good, Nora." It was not an apology. It was not nearly enough. But it was the first time in my adult life my father had asked about my health before asking about his properties, and I filed that under things that are smaller than I deserved and larger than I expected. My mother called the week after that. She asked if we could have lunch, just the two of us, somewhere neutral. I thought about saying no. Then I thought about what neutral actually meant, whether I had any interest in neutral anymore, and decided I could at least be curious. We met at a place near a park I used to go to in high school. She was there before me, which surprised me, because my mother is constitutionally 5 minutes late to everything. She looked tired in a way that was structural, not cosmetic. We ordered. We sat with our coffee. For a while she talked around everything, asking about my recovery, about my coworkers, about whether I'd gotten a new couch I'd mentioned wanting. I answered honestly, and waited. Then she put her cup down and looked at me. "I didn't know how much you were carrying," she said. I looked at her. "I mean, I knew you helped," she said. "I just didn't calculate it. I never sat down and thought about what it cost you, in time, in money, in everything. I let it be invisible, because it was easier for me if it was invisible." There it was. Not dressed up, not redirected toward Delia or toward my father or toward the extenuating circumstances. I said, "Why are you telling me this now?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which also surprised me. "Because I kept waiting for you to get over it and come back," she said. "And somewhere in the last few weeks I realized you weren't coming back to that. That the version of you who did all of that without asking questions was gone. And I needed to figure out whether the person sitting across from me now was someone I actually knew." "Do you?" I asked. "Know me?" She was quiet. "I'm starting to," she said. It wasn't the conversation I had imagined having for years, the one where everything is named and accounted for and someone finally says exactly the right thing in exactly the right sequence. Real life doesn't give you that conversation. What it gives you, if you're lucky, is a quieter and more useful one. One where someone finally tells you the truth they had been organizing around for years. "I'm not the person who handles things for you anymore," I said. "I can be your daughter, but not your free labor, and not your backup plan, and not the one who holds together what would fall apart without me, while everyone pretends it's just happening on its own." She nodded. Once. Small. Like she was conserving something. I know, she said. My sister never called me directly after the confrontation at the house. She sent a text 2 months later, a long one, that I read once and then set aside because it had the structure of an apology but none of the content of one. It was full of sentences like, "I know things haven't been easy, and I think we could have handled some things differently," which is the linguistic equivalent of a gesture made in the wrong direction. I responded with one line, "I hope you're doing better." And I meant it in the clearest possible way, which is that I genuinely hoped she was doing better, and that whether she was or wasn't was no longer a problem I was available to help solve. My father hired a property management company 2 months after I stepped back. It cost them a percentage of the rental income that, when I did the math later, was almost exactly what my invisible labor had been worth if anyone had been accounting for it. He did not mention this to me directly. My mother mentioned it in passing, and I could hear in her voice that she understood what it meant, what it had always cost, and that the number on the management company invoice was the closest thing to acknowledgement my father was capable of producing. I went back to work full-time after 6 weeks. My back was different, in the best way. The nerve pain was gone in a clean and almost startling absence, the way you forget a sound you've been hearing so long you stopped registering it until it stops. I stood at my desk for the first time without bracing. I walked to get coffee without planning the angle of my steps. One evening in the early winter, I drove past the street where my parents' duplex sat, the one with the students, the one I had kept certified and compliant for 4 years without my name on the deed or a dollar of the income. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. I just noted, the way you note something that used to mean something, and now means something different, that the lights were on, and the gutters were clear, and that someone else was responsible for both of those facts now. What I wanted, when this all started, was to be seen. To matter in the specific way that means someone checks on your body when you are sick before asking whether you can still be useful. I thought for a long time that the only way to make that happen was to become more essential, more capable, more indispensable. I thought if I held enough of their world together, eventually they would turn around and see me holding it. What I learned, in the slowest and most expensive way possible, is that people who take you for granted are not going to see you more clearly the harder you work. They are going to see you the same way they always have, which is as something reliable, something ambient, something that will be there when they need it. The only way to be seen differently was to stop being available in the same way. That cost me something real. It cost me the version of my family I had wanted them to be. The one where my father would have handed over the surgery money without a second thought. Where my mother would have driven me to the pre-op appointment. Where my sister would have known I was sick because she had been paying attention. That family was a story I had been telling myself for a very long time. And letting go of a story you've lived inside of is not the same as relief. It's grief. Sometimes it still is. But there is a life on the other side of that grief that belongs entirely to me. Not to the properties, not to the family ledger, not to the unspoken agreement that Nora will handle it. Just mine. My spine that works correctly now. My apartment where the only maintenance requests I file are my own. My best friend who drives me places I'm afraid to go alone and hands me coffee and asks status without making me explain why that word is enough. My worth was never in how much I could hold. I just had to stop holding it long enough to see that. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. Not even for them.